She appeared at Comanche's doorstep during the storm, cradling an infant, and whispered, "She's yours." The words cut through the howling wind like a blade through silence, carrying with them the weight of secrets buried in desert sand and promises broken by war. In that moment, as lightning illuminated her rain-soaked face and the crying child in her arms, 3 lives collided with the force of destiny itself, and nothing in the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory would ever be the same.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The storm had been building all day across the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert. Dark clouds rolling in from the western mountains, like an army advancing on the small frontier town of Copper Ridge. The air hung thick and electric, carrying the scent of creosote and the promise of violence that seemed to permeate everything in this harsh corner of the Arizona Territory. Copper Ridge was not a town that attracted dreamers or the faint of heart. It was a place where copper miners scraped a living from the unforgiving earth, where cattle ranchers fought Apache raiders and Mexican bandits with equal ferocity, and where the law was often whatever a man could enforce with his gun and his will. The main street was nothing more than a wide dirt road flanked by weathered wooden buildings that looked as though they were engaged in a constant battle against the desert wind and sand. At the far end of town, where the last of the buildings gave way to endless scrubland and distant mesas, stood a modest adobe house with thick walls and small, deep-set windows designed to keep out both the scorching summer heat and the rare but violent desert storms. This was where Comanche lived, though few in Copper Ridge knew his real name or the story that had brought him to this isolated place at the edge of civilization. Comanche was not his birth name, of course. He had been born Samuel Garrett in the Green Hills of Tennessee, the youngest son of a Presbyterian minister who believed that salvation could be found through hard work and harder prayer. But that name, that life, belonged to a different man, one who had died in the smoke and carnage of a dozen battlefields during the war between the states, one who had been buried beneath the weight of choices that no man should have to make. The name Comanche had been given to him by the Apache scouts who had found him half dead in the desert 3 years ago, delirious from fever and blood loss after a fight with Mexican raiders who had been terrorizing the scattered ranches along the border. They called him Comanche because he fought like one of the fierce horse warriors of the southern plains, relentless, unpredictable, and utterly without fear of death. The name had stuck, partly because it suited him, and partly because he had never bothered to correct it. In a land where a man's past was his own business and his future was never guaranteed, names were just another luxury that most could not afford. Now, at 32, Comanche had carved out an existence that was solitary but not entirely lonely. He worked as a tracker and guide for the territorial government, hunting down outlaws and bandits in the trackless wastes of the desert. It was dangerous work that required a man to be comfortable with violence and isolation, but it paid well, and asked no questions about what a man might have done before he arrived in Arizona Territory. Most importantly, it allowed Comanche to live on his own terms, answerable to no one but himself and the harsh justice of the desert. His adobe house reflected this independence. The walls were thick enough to stop rifle bullets, the windows positioned to provide clear fields of fire in all directions. Inside, the rooms were sparse but functional, a main room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom barely large enough for a narrow bed and a chest of drawers, and a kitchen equipped with the basics needed to keep a man fed and his weapons clean. The only decoration was a single painting that hung above the fireplace, a landscape of rolling Tennessee hills that seemed impossibly green and gentle compared to the harsh beauty of the Arizona desert. Comanche had been cleaning his rifle when the first drops of rain began to fall, each one striking the hard-packed earth of his yard with a sound like small explosions. Desert rains were rare but fierce, and he could see from the advancing wall of clouds that this would be one of the violent storms that could turn dry arroyos into raging torrents in minutes and wash away anything foolish enough to be caught in the open. He set the rifle aside and moved to secure the shutters on his windows, a precaution learned from hard experience. Desert storms could drive sand and debris with enough force to shatter glass, and a man who could not see what was coming in this country was a man who would not live long. As he worked, Comanche found his thoughts drifting to the strange unease that had been growing in him over the past few days, a feeling that something was approaching, something that would change the careful balance of his solitary life that it was. A feeling he had learned to trust during his years as a tracker. The desert had its own language, its own way of warning those who knew how to listen. Animals behaved differently when danger was near. The wind carried scents and sounds that spoke of distant threats. Even the quality of the light could signal approaching trouble to a man who had spent enough time reading the subtle signs of the wilderness. But this feeling was different. It was not the familiar tension that preceded an encounter with bandits or hostile Apache. This was something more personal, more intimate. It felt like the approach of a reckoning, as though the past he had tried so hard to bury in the desert sand was finally catching up with him. The rain began in earnest as Comanche finished securing the last shutter, fat drops that quickly became a steady downpour. Within minutes, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and the air was filled with the rich, almost intoxicating scent of wet earth, a smell so rare in this arid land that it never failed to stir something deep and primitive in the souls of those who lived here. Comanche retreated to his house and built up the fire in the stone fireplace, more for the comfort of the light than for warmth. The thick adobe walls kept the interior temperature steady regardless of the weather outside. He settled into his chair with a cup of coffee and a book, a collection of Walt Whitman's poetry that he had carried with him since the war. Reading poetry might have seemed an unlikely pastime for a man with his reputation. But Comanche had long ago learned that the most dangerous thing about living alone in the wilderness was not the external threats, but the internal ones. The slow erosion of humanity that came from too much isolation, too much violence, too much silence. The storm intensified as the evening wore on, the rain hammering against the shuttered windows and the roof with increasing fury. Thunder rolled across the desert like artillery fire, and lightning illuminated the darkness in brief, brilliant flashes that turned the landscape into a stark tableau of light and shadow. It was during one of these flashes that Comanche first saw her approaching. He had risen from his chair to add another log to the fire when the lightning flickered, and in that moment of electric illumination, he glimpsed a figure moving through the rain toward his house. The image was so brief and unexpected that for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. But years of survival in hostile territory had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and every nerve in his body was now alert and focused. Comanche moved quickly but quietly to the window, opening the shutter just enough to peer out into the storm. Another flash of lightning confirmed what he had seen, a woman struggling through the mud and rain, moving with the desperate determination of someone who had nowhere else to go. She was still perhaps 100 yards away, but even through the driving rain, he could see that she was carrying something in her arms, something she was protecting from the storm with her own body. For a moment, Comanche hesitated. Visitors were rare in his isolated corner of the territory, and those who came usually brought trouble with them. His first instinct was to remain hidden, to let whoever this was pass by without revealing his presence. But as he watched the figure struggle through the storm, something about her desperation, her obvious exhaustion, touched a part of him that he had thought long dead. He moved to the chest where he kept his weapons, strapping on his gun belt and checking the loads in his Colt revolver. Caution was a habit that had kept him alive this long, and he was not about to abandon it now, even for a woman caught in a storm. But as he prepared to open his door, Comanche found himself thinking of another storm, another night, years ago.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
And far away, when he had been the one in desperate need of shelter and had found only locked doors and suspicious faces. The memory was brief but sharp, and it settled the matter. Whatever this woman's story, whatever had brought her to his door in the middle of a desert storm, she deserved at least the chance to tell it. He would listen. He would help if he could. And if she proved to be a threat, well, he had dealt with threats before. Comanche opened the heavy wooden door just as the woman reached his porch. She stumbled up the 2 wooden steps, her boots slipping on the rain-slicked boards, and for a moment she swayed as though she might collapse. In the light spilling from his doorway, he could see her clearly for the first time, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that hung in wet tangles around a face that would have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion and desperation etched into every line. Her clothes a simple dress that had once been blue but was now stained with mud, and rain clung to her slender frame. And her feet were bare, her shoes apparently lost somewhere in her desperate journey through the storm. But it was what she carried that made Comanche's world tilt on its axis. Wrapped in a blanket that was somehow still dry, despite the woman's soaked condition, was an infant, perhaps 6 months old, with dark hair and skin that spoke of mixed heritage. The child was awake but quiet, dark eyes wide and alert as they fixed on Comanche's face. The woman looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that he recognized, the look of someone who had traveled far beyond the limits of hope and was running on nothing but pure desperation. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the storm, but her words carried across the space between them with perfect clarity. "Are you the one they call Comanche?" she asked. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The woman took a shuddering breath, and when she spoke again, her words changed everything. "My name is Maria Delgado. I've been looking for you for 3 months." She held out the bundle in her arms, and the infant made a soft sound, almost like a question. "She's yours." The words hit Comanche like a physical blow. He stared at the woman, at the child, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he was hearing. The storm continued to rage around them, but in that moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the 3 of them standing. In the doorway between the wild darkness of the desert and the warm light of his home. "That's impossible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he found himself studying the child's features, looking for similarities, for proof or denial of the claim that had just shattered his carefully ordered world. Maria swayed again. And this time she did stumble, catching herself against the doorframe. "Please," she whispered. "I'll explain everything. But please, can we come in? She's been through so much already." Comanche looked at the woman Maria and saw that she was at the end of her strength. Whatever her story, whatever had brought her to his door with this impossible claim, she was clearly in no condition to continue traveling. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the nearest town was 15 miles away across terrain that would be treacherous even in good weather. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Coming out of the rain," he said. "We'll figure out the rest once you're warm and dry." Maria stumbled across the threshold, water streaming from her clothes, onto the wooden floor. She stood in the middle of his main room, swaying slightly as she clutched the infant to her chest, and Comanche could see that she was fighting to stay conscious. "Sit," he said, guiding her to the chair by the fire. "You're exhausted." Maria sank into the chair gratefully, but she did not relax her protective grip on the child. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you would help." Comanche moved to his kitchen area and began preparing coffee, his movements automatic, while his mind struggled to process the situation. A woman had appeared at his door, claiming that he was the father of her child. It was impossible, of course. He had been careful about such things, always. But as he worked, he found himself glancing repeatedly at the infant, studying the small face for any feature that might be familiar. The child was beautiful, there was no denying that. Dark hair, olive skin, and large, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything with a gravity unusual in one so young. There was something about the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth, that nagged at him, though he could not quite place what. It was, "How do you take your coffee?" he asked, needing something practical to focus on while his world rearranged itself around this new reality. "Black is fine," Maria replied. Her voice was stronger now that she was out of the storm, but Comanche could hear the weariness that went bone deep. "Thank you for letting us in. I know this must be confusing." Comanche poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to her, careful to keep his distance. Trust was not something that came easily to him, and extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. "Confusing is one word for it," he said. "Why don't you start from the beginning? How do you even know my name?" Maria took a sip of the coffee and closed her eyes for a moment, as though drawing strength from its warmth. When she opened them again, her gaze was direct and unwavering. "Because you knew my sister," she said, "Isabella Delgado. You knew her. In Tucson 2 years ago." The name hit Comanche like a lightning strike, and suddenly the nagging familiarity he had seen in the child's features made perfect sense. Isabella, beautiful, passionate Isabella, with her laughing eyes and her fierce independence. Isabella, who had appeared in his life like a desert flower blooming after rain and had vanished just as suddenly, leaving behind only memories and a longing that he had tried for 2 years to forget. He sank into the chair across from Maria, his coffee cup forgotten in his hands. "Isabella," he said, and her name was like a prayer and a curse combined. "What happened to her? Where is she?" Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she held the infant more tightly. "She's dead," she said simply. "Calura, 6 months ago. She died giving birth to your daughter." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room, punctuated only by the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the soft crackling of the fire. Comanche stared at Maria, at the child she held, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. Isabella was dead. The woman who had captured his heart and then disappeared without explanation was gone forever. And she had left behind a daughter. His daughter. "Tell me," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. "Tell me everything." Maria adjusted her grip on the sleeping infant and began to speak, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall. "Isabella never told you she was pregnant, did she? She found out after you left Tucson. She was she was afraid, I think. Afraid of what it would mean, afraid of how you would react." Comanche remembered his last conversation with Isabella, the fight they had had about his decision to leave Tucson and return to his solitary life in the desert. She had accused him of running away from anything real, anything that required commitment. He had accused her of trying to tie him down, of not understanding that his life was too dangerous, too uncertain, for the kind of future she seemed to want. They had both said things that night that could not be taken back. Words born of frustration and fear and love that neither of them had been brave enough to acknowledge. The next morning, he had packed his few possessions and ridden out of Tucson without looking back, telling himself that it was better this way, that Isabella deserved someone who could give her the stable, respectable life she deserved. She came to live with me in Santa Fe, Maria continued. She didn't tell anyone else in the family about the baby's father. Just said that he was a good man who didn't know about the child. She made me promise not to try to find you, said that if you had wanted to stay, you would have stayed. Comanche felt a stab of pain that was almost physical. Isabella had been pregnant with his child, had faced the scandal and difficulty of an unmarried pregnancy alone, because she believed he did not want her. The irony was bitter beyond words. He had left Tucson because he loved her too much to burden her with his dangerous, uncertain life, and she had interpreted his departure as abandonment. But she changed her mind? He asked. Maria nodded. At the end, when she knew she was dying, she made me promise to find you. She said that her daughter deserved to know her father, deserved to have family. She gave me this to give to you. Maria reached into the folds of her wet dress and pulled out a small object wrapped in oiled cloth. She said you would remember. With trembling hands, Comanche unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. He remembered it well. It had belonged to Isabella's grandmother, and she had worn it every day. Inside, he knew, was a tiny photograph of Isabella as a child, laughing and carefree in a way that the harsh realities of frontier life rarely allowed. She wanted you to have it, Maria said softly. She said to tell you that she understood why you left, that she forgave you for being afraid. But she also said to tell you that love is supposed to make us braver, not more afraid. Comanche stared at the locket, remembering Isabella's words from their last fight. You're so afraid of losing something that you won't even let yourself have it. What kind of life is that, Sam? What kind of love is that? At the time, her words had stung because they were true. He had been afraid of the vulnerability that love required, afraid of the responsibility, afraid of failing someone who mattered more to him than his own life. So he had run, as he had been running from commitment and connection for most of his adult life. But now, looking at the child in Maria's arms, his child, Isabella's child, Comanche realized that his fear had cost him everything that truly mattered. Isabella was dead, and he had never had the chance to tell her that he loved her, that he was sorry, that he would have stayed if he had known she needed him. What's her name? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena, Maria replied. Isabella named her Elena after our grandmother. She said it means bright light in our family, because our grandmother always said that children are the light that guides us through the darkness. Comanche looked at the sleeping infant, at Elena, and felt something crack open inside his chest. She was so small, so perfect, so utterly dependent on the adults around her for everything she needed to survive. And she was his daughter, the living legacy of the love he had been too afraid to claim. She looks like her, he said, and it was true. Even at 6 months old, Elena had Isabella's delicate features, her dark hair, her olive complexion. But there was something else there too, something that might have been his own stubborn chin, his own determined expression. Yes, Maria agreed. She has Isabella's beauty, but I think she has your strength. She's been so good during our journey, so patient and brave. Isabella would be proud. Comanche set down his coffee cup and stood up, pacing to the window and back as he tried to process everything he had learned. Isabella was dead. He had a daughter. A woman he had never met, had traveled hundreds of miles through dangerous territory to bring that daughter to him. His entire world had changed in the space of a single conversation. Why? He asked suddenly, turning to face Maria. Why did you do this? Why did you risk so much to bring her to me? You could have raised her yourself, or found her a family in Santa Fe. Why make such a dangerous journey to find a man Isabella never even told you about? Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as though trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally she spoke. Because Isabella made me promise, she said. But also because Elena deserves to know where she comes from, who her father is, and because ... She hesitated, then continued. Because I've seen what happens to children who grow up without knowing their parents. I was raised by my aunt after my parents died, and no matter how much love she gave me, there was always a part of me that felt incomplete, that wondered about the people who gave me life. Comanche understood. He had lost his own parents young, had spent most of his adult life wondering what kind of man he might have become if he had grown up with a father's guidance, a mother's love. The idea that his daughter might grow up with the same sense of incompleteness, the same questions about her identity, was unbearable. "There's something else," Maria said, her voice becoming more hesitant. "The journey here. It wasn't easy. There are people who don't want Elena to find her father. People who think a child of mixed blood is better off hidden away or ... She didn't finish the sentence, but Comanche understood. The Arizona Territory was not a place that looked kindly on racial mixing, and a child with both Mexican and Anglo heritage would face challenges and prejudices that most people could not. Imagine, there were those who would see Elena as an abomination rather than a blessing, who would seek to harm her simply because of who her parents were. "Who?" Comanche asked, his voice taking on the hard edge that men in Copper Ridge had learned. "To fear. Who's been threatening her?" Maria looked frightened by the change in his tone, but she answered, "Isabella's father, our father. When he found out about the baby after Isabella died, he was not pleased. He said the family's honor had been stained, that Elena was evidence of Isabella's sin. He wanted to send her to an orphanage, or worse." Comanche felt a cold fury building in his chest. The idea that anyone would harm a child, his child, because of the circumstances of her birth, was both incomprehensible and unforgivable. "Is that why you left Santa Fe? Because of him?" "Partly," Maria admitted, "but also because I knew it was what Isabella would have wanted. She talked about you sometimes, when she thought I wasn't listening. She said you were a good man who had been hurt by the world, who had forgotten how to trust people. She said she hoped that someday you would find peace, that you would learn to let people love you." The words were like a blade to his heart. Isabella had understood him better than he had understood himself, had seen through his carefully constructed defenses to the scared, lonely man beneath. And she had loved him anyway, had carried his child and died protecting his daughter from a world that would judge her harshly. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small adobe house, a different kind of tempest was building. Comanche looked at Maria, at Elena, and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "She's safe now," he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never broken a promise he chose to make. "Both of you are safe. Whatever it takes, whoever stands against us, Elena will grow up knowing who she is and where she belongs." Maria's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Isabella was right about you. You are a good man." Comanche wasn't sure about that. He had done things in his life that good men didn't do, had made choices that would haunt him until his dying day. But as he looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully in her aunt's arms, he knew that he had been given a chance at redemption, an opportunity to become the man Isabella had believed he could be. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the thunder growing more distant, the rain settling into a steady but gentler rhythm. But for Comanche, the real storm was just beginning. He had a daughter now, a family, and that meant he had something worth fighting for, something worth protecting with his life. And in the Arizona Territory, where the law was uncertain and danger lurked behind every mesa, that fight was sure to come sooner rather than later. As if summoned by his thoughts, Elena stirred in Maria's arms and opened her dark eyes, fixing them on Comanche's face with an intensity that seemed impossible in one so young. For a moment, father and daughter simply looked at each other, and Comanche felt something shift in his soul, something he had thought long dead coming back to life. He was no longer just Comanche, the solitary tracker who answered to no one. He was Elena's father, and that meant everything had changed. The question now was whether he was strong enough, brave enough, to become the man his daughter deserved, and whether he could protect her from all the dangers that were surely coming. The Copper Crown Saloon sat at the corner of Meyer and Congress Streets in Tucson, establishment that catered to miners, ranchers, and the occasional territorial official who needed to conduct business away from prying eyes. Unlike the rougher drinking holes that dotted the frontier town, the Copper Crown maintained a veneer of respectability: clean glasses, decent whiskey, and entertainment, that stopped just short of scandalous. It was here that Samuel Garrett, not yet known as Comanche, first laid eyes on Isabella Delgado on a warm April evening when the desert air carried the scent of blooming Palo Verde and the promise of another brutal summer ahead. He had come to Tucson to deliver a captured horse thief to the territorial marshal, a routine job that should have taken no more than a day or two. Instead, he found himself staying for 3 months, and it was all because of the woman who served drinks with the grace of a dancer and the sharp wit of a seasoned politician. Isabella was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of polite society. She was too strong-willed, too independent, too comfortable in her own skin to fit the delicate mold that Eastern ladies were expected to fill. But in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory, where survival required strength, and beauty was measured in different terms, Isabella Delgado was magnificent. She had dark hair that caught the lamplight like spun silk, eyes the color of rich coffee that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul, and a smile that could make a hardened gunfighter forget his own name. But it was her spirit that truly captivated Samuel. The way she could silence a rowdy drunk with nothing but a look. The way she defended the younger girls who worked in the saloon from unwanted advances. The way she carried herself with dignity. Despite working in an establishment that polite society looked down upon. Samuel had initially planned to avoid the Copper Crown altogether. Saloons were places where trouble found men like him, where too much whiskey and too many questions could lead to complications he preferred to avoid. But the marshal had recommended the place for a decent meal and a clean room, and Samuel's horse needed shoeing, and somehow one night turned into 2, then a week, then something that felt dangerously close to settling down. The first time Isabella spoke to him, it was to ask if he was planning to cause trouble in her establishment. Samuel had been sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the room with the careful attention of a man who had learned that relaxing one's guard was often the last mistake a person ever made. He must have looked dangerous because the other patrons were giving him a wide berth, and the saloon girls were steering clear of his table. "You're making my customers nervous," Isabella said, setting a fresh glass down without being asked. "They're afraid you're here to arrest someone, or worse." Samuel looked up at her, taking in the directness of her gaze, the way she stood with her hands on her hips as though she owned not just the saloon but the entire territory. "I'm not here to arrest anyone," he said. "Just passing through." "Passing through for 2 weeks now," Isabella observed. "That's a mighty slow passage." Samuel found himself smiling despite his habitual caution. "Maybe I like the scenery." "The scenery," Isabella repeated, one eyebrow raised. "Well, the scenery would appreciate it if you'd try to look a little less like you're planning to shoot someone. It's bad for business." That conversation led to another, then another. Samuel found himself looking forward to the evenings when Isabella would take her break and sit with him, sharing stories about the characters who frequented the saloon, the politics of territorial life, and her dreams of someday opening her own restaurant in San Francisco or Denver, somewhere civilized where a woman could make her own way without constantly fighting for respect. Isabella had been born in Sonora, Mexico, but had come north with her family when she was 15, seeking opportunities that the endless revolutions and upheavals south of the border had made impossible. Her father, Diego Delgado, was a proud man who had owned a successful ranch in Mexico before losing everything to bandits and corrupt officials. In Tucson, he had tried to rebuild, but pride and unfamiliarity with American ways had led to a series of failed business ventures that left the family struggling to survive. Isabella's work at the Copper Crown was both a necessity and a source of family shame. Her father viewed it as a temporary humiliation, a stepping stone to better things. Her mother prayed nightly for Isabella to find a suitable husband who could restore the family's honor. But Isabella herself saw it differently, as independence. as a chance to earn her own money and make her own choices in a world that offered women precious little of either. "My father thinks I'm wasting my life," she told Samuel one evening as they sat on the saloon's back porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "He says a woman's honor is like a flower. Once it's picked, it can never be replanted. What do you think?" Samuel asked. Isabella was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think honor is what you make it," she said finally. "I think it's how you treat people, how you stand up for what's right, how you face the world with courage. I don't think it has anything to do with whether you serve drinks in a saloon or sit in a parlor embroidering doilies." It was conversations like these that made Samuel begin to reconsider everything he thought he knew about his own life. Isabella challenged him in ways that no one ever had, forced him to examine beliefs and assumptions he had never questioned. She made him want to be better than he was, to become the kind of man who deserved a woman like her. But even as he found himself falling deeper in love with Isabella, Samuel was haunted by the knowledge that his past made any real future between them impossible. He had done things during the war, made choices in the years since, that would horrify her if she knew the truth. He was a man with blood on his hands and enemies who would never stop hunting him. How could he ask a woman like Isabella to share such a life? The internal conflict came to a head one night in late June, when a man from Samuel's past walked into the Copper Crown and recognized him. Jake Morrison had served in the same unit during the war, had been present during some of Samuel's darkest moments. Morrison was drunk and bitter, his own life having taken a series of bad turns since the war ended, and he saw Samuel's apparent happiness as something to be destroyed. "Well, well," Morrison announced loudly, swaying slightly as he approached Samuel's table. "If it isn't Samuel Garrett, the hero of Shiloh. Though I heard you were calling yourself something else these days." Samuel felt every muscle in his body tense. Around the saloon, conversation stopped as patrons sensed trouble brewing. Isabella, who had been talking to customers at another table, turned to see what was happening. "You're drunk, Morrison," Samuel said quietly. "Why don't you go sleep it off?" "Drunk, maybe," Morrison replied, "but not so drunk I can't recognize a killer when I see one. Tell me, Garrett, does that pretty Mexican girl know what you did during the war? Does she know about Andersonville?" The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Andersonville was a wound that had never healed, a place where Union prisoners had been held in conditions so horrific that decent men still woke up screaming from nightmares about it. Samuel had been there, had done things in the name of duty and survival that he could never forgive himself for. "That's enough," Samuel said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. But Morrison was beyond reason, beyond the basic survival instinct that should have warned him he was pushing a dangerous man too far. "She should know," he continued, his voice getting louder. "Should know that her boyfriend was one of the guards at the worst prison camp in the Confederacy. Should know how many Union boys died because of men like him." The saloon had gone completely silent now. Isabella was staring at Samuel with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Other patrons were beginning to edge toward the exits. Sensing that violence was about to erupt, Samuel stood slowly, his face deadly calm. "Morrison, you've got about 10 seconds to walk out of here before I do something we'll both regret." "The truth hurts, doesn't it?" Morrison sneered. "How many prisoners did you let die, Garrett? How many boys who just wanted to go home to their families?" Samuel's control finally snapped. He moved faster than the eye could follow, his fist connecting with Morrison's jaw with a sound like a gunshot. Morrison went down hard, hitting the floor with a thud that shook the entire building. He tried to get up, blood streaming from his nose, but Samuel was already standing over him. "I said that was enough," Samuel said, his voice carrying a cold finality that made everyone in the room take another step back. "You want to stay breathing, you'll keep my past out of your mouth." Morrison looked up at him with eyes full of hate and fear, then slowly hauled himself to his feet. "This ain't over, Garrett," he mumbled through his split lips. "People deserve to know what kind of man you really are." He stumbled toward the door, pausing only to look back at Isabella. "Ask him about Andersonville, Senorita. Ask him how many men died on his watch." After Morrison left, the saloon slowly returned to normal, but the damage was done. Isabella wouldn't meet Samuel's eyes for the rest of the evening, and when he tried to approach her, she turned away. It wasn't until the saloon closed and the last customer had gone home that they finally faced each other. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the pain and confusion in her eyes, the way she held herself as though preparing for another blow. He could lie, he realized. Morrison was drunk and unreliable, and there were no other witnesses to contradict whatever story Samuel chose to tell. But Isabella deserved better than lies, even if the truth destroyed everything between them. "Yes," he said simply. "It's true." Isabella closed her eyes, and Samuel could see her struggling to process what she had learned. When she opened them again, there were tears threatening to spill over. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened." So Samuel told her. He told her about the war, about the impossible choices that young men were forced to make in impossible circumstances. He told her about Andersonville, about the orders he had followed and the orders he had refused to follow, about the prisoners who had died despite his efforts to help them and the ones who had died because of them. He told her about the nightmares that still haunted his sleep, about the guilt that had driven him west in search of something that might pass for redemption. Isabella listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Samuel finished, they sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his confession hanging between them like a wall. "I never meant for you to find out like this," Samuel said finally. "I was going to tell you eventually, but were you?" Isabella asked, and there was something in her voice that Samuel had never heard before: doubt, disappointment, the sound of trust beginning to crack. "Or were you just going to keep lying to me forever?" "I never lied to you," Samuel protested. "I just I didn't tell you everything." "The same thing," Isabella said sharply. "You let me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist. You let me believe you were someone you're not." "I am who I am with you," Samuel said desperately. "Isabella, what happened during the war? That was a different person, a different life. What we have here, what we've built together, that's real." Isabella stood up, pacing to the window and back, her hands clenched into fists. "How can I know what's real anymore, Sam? How can I trust anything you've told me when you've been hiding something this important?" "Because you know me," Samuel said, standing as well. "You know who I am in my heart. You've seen me with the people in this town, with you. You know I'm not a monster." "Do I?" Isabella turned to face him, and Samuel saw that the tears had started to fall. "Because right now, I don't know what to think. I don't know how to reconcile the man I love with the man who did those things." They argued long into the night, their voices raised in anger and pain and frustration. Isabella accused Samuel of being a coward for not trusting her with the truth. Samuel accused Isabella of being naive about the realities of war, about the impossible choices that men were sometimes forced to make. Both of them said things they didn't mean, words born of fear and hurt that would echo in their memories for years to come. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the desert, Samuel made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "Maybe I am a coward. Maybe you deserve better than someone with my past." "That's not what I said," Isabella protested, but Samuel was already turning away. "I'll be gone by noon," he said without looking back. "It's better this way. You can find someone who doesn't carry the kind of baggage I do, someone who can give you the life you deserve." "Sam, wait," Isabella called after him, but he was already walking away, his shoulders set with the rigid determination of a man who had made up his mind. Samuel packed his few belongings and saddled his horse while the town was still sleeping. He left money on his hotel room dresser to cover his bill and rode out of Tucson as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that Isabella would be better off without him, that love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between who he had been and who she needed him to be. But as he rode north toward the mountains, Samuel couldn't shake the image of Isabella's face as he walked away from her. The confusion and pain in her eyes, the way her hand had reached out toward him as though she wanted to call him back, but couldn't find the words. He had no way of knowing that Isabella was already carrying his child, that his departure had left her not just heartbroken, but facing a scandal that would destroy her family's reputation and her own future. He had no way of knowing that she would spend the remaining months of her pregnancy hoping he would return, that she would name their daughter Elena after her grandmother, who had always believed that love could conquer any obstacle. Samuel rode north and disappeared into the wilderness, eventually becoming the man known as Comanche, the solitary tracker who worked alone and trusted no one. He buried his past beneath a new name and a reputation for being untouchable, unreachable, a man who felt nothing and needed no one. But in the quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking, Samuel would remember Isabella's laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, the warmth of her hand in his. He would remember what it felt like to be loved by someone who saw the best in him, and he would wonder if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Now, 2 years later, sitting in his adobe house with Isabella's sister and Isabella's child, Samuel finally understood the true cost of his cowardice. Isabella was dead, and their daughter had grown up without a father because he had been too afraid to fight for the love they had shared. He had thought he was protecting Isabella by leaving, but instead he had abandoned her when she needed him most. The knowledge was like a knife twisting in his chest, but it also brought a strange kind of clarity. He could not undo the past, could not bring Isabella back or reclaim the time he had lost with his daughter, but he could choose differently now. He could be the man Isabella had believed he could become, the father Elena deserved. As the storm outside began to subside, and the first pale light of dawn crept through the shutters, Samuel looked at his sleeping daughter and made a silent vow. He would not run again. Whatever dangers came, whatever enemies emerged from his past to threaten his family, he would stand and fight. Elena would grow up knowing her father, knowing she was loved and protected and valued. It was a promise that would soon be tested, in ways Samuel could never have imagined, but for now, it was enough. The past was finished, its secrets finally revealed. The future, dangerous and uncertain as it might be, was just beginning. Maria stirred in her chair, Elena still peaceful in her arms, and Samuel realized that his solitary life was over. He was part of a family now, with all the joy and terror that entailed. The man who had once been afraid of connection, afraid of the vulnerability that love required, was about to discover just how far he would go to protect the people who mattered most. The real test was coming, and it would arrive sooner than any of them expected. The desert dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold as the last of the storm clouds retreated toward the eastern mountains. Comanche stood at his window, watching the sunrise while his daughter slept in his arms for the first time. Elena had awakened an hour before dawn, fussing and crying until Maria, exhausted from their ordeal, had wordlessly passed her to him. The moment Elena settled against his chest, her tiny fist curling around his finger, something fundamental had shifted in Samuel Garrett's soul. Maria had finally succumbed to sleep in his bed, still wearing her damp traveling clothes, but too exhausted to care. Comanche had covered her with a blanket and taken Elena to the main room, where he now stood watching the world wake up while holding the most precious thing he had ever possessed. The baby was warm and solid in his arms, her breathing soft and even, her dark eyes occasionally fluttering open to study his face with an intensity that seemed impossible in one so young. "You look just like her," he whispered to Elena, remembering Isabella's face in the lamplight of the Copper Crown Saloon. "Your mama was the most beautiful woman in all of Arizona Territory, little one. She was brave and smart and strong, and she loved you more than life itself." Elena made a soft sound, almost like she was listening, and Comanche felt his heart clench with a mixture of love and grief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. This child was all he had left of. Isabella, a living reminder of the love he had been too afraid to claim and too proud to fight for. But she was also something more. She was hope, possibility, a chance for redemption that he had never dared imagine. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Comanche tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun belt even as he held Elena closer to his chest. Visitors at dawn in this remote corner of the territory rarely brought good news, and after Maria's story about Isabella's father and his threats, Comanche was expecting trouble. He moved carefully to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. What he saw made his blood run cold. 6 riders were approaching his house, moving with the purposeful formation of men who had come prepared for violence. Leading them was a man Comanche recognized from Maria's description, Diego Delgado, Isabella's father. His weathered face set in lines of implacable determination and righteous fury. Delgado was a man in his 60s, but he sat his horse with the straight-backed pride of old Spanish nobility. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the long ride, his clothes expensive but practical, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command and obedience. But it was his eyes that caught Comanche's attention, dark, intelligent, and burning with the kind of hatred that could drive a man to extreme measures. The 5 men riding with Delgado were clearly hired guns, the kind of hard-faced killers who could be found in any frontier town if a man had enough money and few enough scruples. They wore their weapons with the casual confidence of professionals, and their eyes swept the area with the constant vigilance of men who lived by violence and expected to die the same way. Elena stirred in Comanche's arms, perhaps sensing his tension, and let out a small cry. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness, and Comanche cursed silently as he saw Delgado's head turn toward the house. There would be no avoiding this confrontation, no pretending he wasn't home. Diego Delgado had come for his granddaughter, and he had brought enough firepower to ensure he got what he wanted. Comanche gently laid Elena in the wooden crate he had hastily lined with blankets to serve as a makeshift crib, then checked his weapons. His Colt was loaded and ready, and he had a shotgun within easy reach. But 6 against 1 were poor odds, especially when he had to protect not just himself, but Maria and Elena as well. The riders stopped about 30 yards from the house, spreading out in a semicircle that would make it difficult for anyone inside to find cover from all angles. Delgado nudged his horse forward a few more steps and called out in heavily accented English, "Samuel Garrett, I know you are in there. I know my daughter Maria brought the bastard child to you. Come out and face me like a man, or I will burn this place down around your ears." Comanche moved to the door, but didn't open it. "What do you want, Delgado?" he called back. "What I want," Diego replied, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air, "is to undo the damage my foolish daughters have done to our family's honor. Isabella shamed us all with her sinful behavior, and now Maria has compounded that shame by bringing the evidence of that sin to you." "The child is innocent," Comanche said, his own voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Whatever you think of Isabella or me, Elena has done nothing wrong." Diego's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Innocent? That abomination is living proof of my daughter's degradation. A constant reminder that she chose to lie with a gringo killer rather than accept the respectable marriage I arranged for her. As long as that child lives, the stain on our family honor can never be cleansed." Behind Comanche, Maria had awakened and was listening to the exchange with growing horror. She moved to the window and peered out, her face going pale as she saw her father and his hired guns. "How did he find us so quickly?" she whispered. "He must have been tracking you," Comanche replied grimly. "How long have you been running?" 3 weeks, Maria said. "Ever since Elena recovered from the fever that nearly killed her. Father wanted to. He said she would be better off dead than living as a half-breed bastard. I couldn't let him hurt her, so I took her and ran." Comanche felt a fresh surge of rage at the thought of a grown man threatening to harm a helpless infant. "He won't touch her," he said with deadly certainty. "I promise you that." Outside, Diego was growing impatient. "Garrett, you have 10 seconds to bring me that child, or my men start shooting. You may be fast with a gun, but you cannot fight. All of us and protect the women at the same time." Comanche knew Delgado was right. In a straight fight, he might be able to take down 3 or even 4 of the gunmen, but not all 6, and not while keeping Maria and Elena safe. He needed to find another way, something that would give him an advantage or at least level the playing field. "What exactly are you proposing?" Comanche called out, buying time while his mind raced through possibilities. "Simple," Diego replied. "You give me the child, and I will take her back to Santa Fe where she belongs. Maria will return home to marry the man I have chosen for her, and you will disappear back into whatever hole you crawled out of. Everyone gets what they deserve." "And what happens to Elena in Santa Fe?" Comanche asked, though he already suspected the answer. Diego's silence was answer enough. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice cold as winter wind. "The child will be cared for appropriately. There are institutions for such unfortunate creatures, places where she can be kept away from decent society." "You mean orphanages," Maria said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Or worse, father, she's your granddaughter. How can you even think of such a thing?" "She is no granddaughter of mine," Diego replied harshly. "She's the spawn of sin and shame, and I will not have her existence contaminating our family name any longer." Comanche had heard enough. He opened the door, just wide enough to show himself, his hand resting visibly on his gun butt. "Here's my counter-proposal, Delgado. You and your hired killers ride out of here right now, and I won't shoot you where you sit. The child stays with me, where she belongs." Diego's face darkened with fury. "You dare threaten me? You who corrupted my daughter and destroyed her virtue? You have no rights here, gringo. No claim on that child." "I have every right," Comanche replied, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. "She's my daughter, and I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else harm her." "Your daughter?" Diego laughed bitterly. "You abandoned Isabella when she needed you most. You ran away like a coward rather than face your responsibilities. What kind of father does that make you?" The words hit their mark, and Comanche felt the familiar stab of guilt and regret. Diego was right. He had abandoned Isabella, had left her to face pregnancy and scandal alone. But that was exactly why he couldn't fail Elena now. This was his chance to make amends, to become the man Isabella had believed he could be. "You're right," Comanche said, surprising everyone, including himself. "I was a coward. I ran when Isabella needed me, and she died because of my weakness. But I won't run again. Elena is my daughter, and she stays with me." Diego's expression shifted from anger to cold calculation. "Then you have chosen your path, and you will die on it. Miguel, take the shot." One of the hired guns, a lean man with dead eyes and a rifle already raised, squeezed the trigger. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Comanche's head. And suddenly the morning exploded into violence. Comanche slammed the door shut and threw himself to the side as more bullets punched through the thick adobe walls. Maria screamed and threw herself over Elena's makeshift crib, shielding the baby with her own body. Outside, the gunmen were shouting orders and spreading out to surround the house. The back room. Comanche shouted to Maria over the gunfire. "Get Elena to the back room and stay down." Maria scooped up the crying baby and ran toward the rear of the house while Comanche grabbed his shotgun and moved to the window. He could see the gunmen taking positions behind whatever cover they could. Find a water trough, a pile of firewood, the corner of his small stable. They were professional killers, but they were also operating in unfamiliar terrain while he knew every inch of his property. Comanche smashed out the glass of his front window with the shotgun barrel and fired both barrels at the gunman crouched behind the water trough. The man screamed and fell backward, clutching his shoulder where the buckshot had torn through muscle and bone. The other gunman immediately opened fire on the window, forcing Comanche to duck back as bullets whined overhead. "Burn him out!" Diego shouted. "Set fire to the house," Comanche cursed. Fire was his worst nightmare in this dry climate, and Diego knew it. If they managed to set the adobe house ablaze, he would have no choice but to come out into the open where the gunman could pick him off at leisure. He reloaded the shotgun and moved to the side window, trying to get a better angle on the men, approaching with burning brands torn from his own woodpile. The irony was not lost on him. They were using his own preparations against him, turning his carefully gathered winter fuel into weapons of destruction. A bullet smashed through the window just as Comanche raised his weapon, and he felt the hot sting as wood splinters cut his cheek. He fired anyway, and one of the men carrying fire stumbled and fell, his torch rolling harmlessly away from the house. But there were others, and they were closing in from multiple directions. From the back room came the sound of Elena crying. A thin, terrified wail that cut through the gunfire like a knife through Comanche's heart. She was an innocent child caught in a battle between adults who should have known better, and the sound of her fear filled him with a rage, so pure and focused that it burned away all doubt and hesitation. These men had come to take his daughter, to harm or destroy her because of the circumstances of her birth. They represented everything that was wrong with a world that judged children by the sins of their parents, that valued honor and reputation more than human life. And Comanche suddenly realized that this fight was about more than just protecting Elena. It was about proving that love could triumph over hatred, that family meant more than bloodlines or social expectations. He moved to the kitchen area and found what he was looking for, a can of kerosene he used for his lamps. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation had often served him well in the past. He soaked a dish towel in the kerosene, lit it from the stove, and hurled it out the broken front window toward the pile of wood where two of the gunmen were taking cover. The result was more spectacular than he had hoped. The dry wood caught fire immediately, creating a wall of flame that forced the men to abandon their position. In their panic, one of them ran directly into Comanche's line of sight, and a single shot from his Colt dropped the man in his tracks. The victory was short-lived. Even as he eliminated one threat, Comanche could see another developing. Diego had dismounted and was approaching the house from the side, using the smoke and confusion as cover. The old man might be driven by pride and prejudice, but he was no coward. He was coming to finish this personally. Comanche checked his weapons and ammunition. He had perhaps a dozen rounds left for his pistol and one more load for the shotgun. Against 4 remaining gunmen and Diego himself, it might not be enough. But as Elena's crying continued from the back room, he knew he would fight to his last breath before he let these men harm his daughter. The attack came from 2 directions. Simultaneously, 3 gunmen rushed the front of the house while Diego and another man came through the back. It was a coordinated assault designed to divide Comanche's attention and overwhelm his defenses. And it nearly worked. Comanche fired the shotgun through the front door, hearing a scream that told him at least one of his attackers had been hit. But before he could reload, gunfire erupted from the back of the house, and he heard Maria cry out in pain or fear. Abandoning the front assault, Comanche ran toward the back room, his Colt in his hand and murder in his heart. He found Diego holding Maria at gunpoint while another gunman covered them both. Elena was on the floor in her blankets, screaming with the desperate intensity of a child who sensed mortal danger. "Drop your weapon, Garrett," Diego commanded, his own pistol pressed against Maria's temple. "Drop it, or I kill my own daughter for the traitor she has become." Comanche found himself in an impossible position. If he dropped his gun, Diego would almost certainly kill all three of them. But if he didn't, Maria would die, and Elena would be left defenseless. Either choice meant failure, meant the destruction of the family he had just discovered. But as he hesitated, Elena's crying suddenly stopped. The baby looked directly at him with those dark eyes that were so much like Isabella's, and in that moment, Comanche understood what he had to do. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't even just about protecting Elena and Maria. This was about proving that some things were worth any sacrifice, that love and family were stronger than hatred and pride. "You want her so badly?" Comanche said to Diego, his voice deadly calm. "Come and take her." What happened next would be talked about in Copper Ridge for years to come. A story that grew in the telling but never lost its essential truth, that sometimes a man discovers what he's truly made of only when everything he cares about is threatened. With destruction, the final confrontation was about to begin, and only one side would walk away from it alive. The tension in the back room stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Diego Delgado held his pistol pressed against Maria's temple, while his hired gun kept his rifle trained on Comanche. Elena lay on her blankets between them, her dark eyes wide and strangely quiet, as if she sensed that her entire future hung. In the balance of the next few seconds, Comanche's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in disaster. Diego was too far away for a clean shot, and even if he could take down the old man, the other gunman would kill him before he could turn his weapon. But surrendering meant certain death for all of them. Diego had made it clear that he considered Elena an abomination that needed to be eliminated, and Maria a traitor who deserved punishment. "You have 5 seconds, Garrett," Diego said, his voice steady despite the hatred burning in his eyes. "Drop your weapon or watch my daughter die." "Father, please," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's just a baby. She's your own blood." "She is no blood of mine," Diego replied coldly. "She is the product of sin and shame. I will not have her existence staining our family name for generations to come." It was then that the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air, not the careful approach of more attackers, but the thundering hoofbeats of riders, moving at full gallop. Everyone in the room froze, uncertain whether the newcomers represented salvation or additional danger. Through the broken windows came the sound of shouting voices, but not in Spanish or the rough English of frontier gunmen. These voices carried the crisp authority of military command, and Comanche felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. "This is Captain William Harrison, United States Cavalry," came a voice from outside. "You men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately." Diego's face went pale as he realized the implications. The territorial government had been cracking down hard on vigilante justice and private armies, especially those that cross state lines in pursuit of their goals. If federal troops had tracked them to Copper Ridge, Diego and his men were facing charges that could put them in territorial prison for decades. "Impossible," Diego muttered. "How could they have found us so quickly?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Through the front door, which had been shot full of holes during the earlier firefight, came a voice that made Comanche's blood run cold with recognition. "Because I led them here, you old fool." Jake Morrison stepped through the doorway, but he was not the drunken, bitter man who had confronted Comanche in the Copper Crown Saloon 2 years earlier. This Morrison wore the uniform of a territorial marshal, complete with a silver badge that caught the morning sunlight. His face was clean-shaven and sober, his bearing that of a man who had found purpose and direction in his life. "Morrison," Comanche said, his gun still trained on Diego despite the marshal's presence. "What are you doing here?" "My job," Morrison replied, his own weapon drawn but held low. "I've been tracking Delgado and his hired killers for 3 weeks. Ever since they crossed into Arizona territory. Kidnapping, attempted murder, and now this, enough charges to hang the lot of them." Diego's hired gunman shifted nervously, clearly calculating whether he could shoot his way out of a situation that had suddenly become much more complicated. But Morrison seemed to read his thoughts. "I wouldn't try it, friend. There are 20 cavalry troopers surrounding this house, all of them with orders to shoot anyone who doesn't surrender peacefully. Your best bet is to drop that rifle and hope a judge shows mercy." "This is family business," Diego snarled, though his grip on his pistol had loosened slightly. "The federal government has no right to interfere." "It became federal business when you hired killers and crossed territorial lines," Morrison replied. "And it became personal business when you threatened to harm a child." He looked directly at Comanche. "That's right, Garrett. I know about the baby. Know she's yours and Isabella's." Comanche felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "How could you possibly know that?" Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Because Isabella told me herself, just before she died. I was in Santa Fe on business when the cholera epidemic hit. Found her in a charity hospital, dying and alone except for her sister. She was delirious with fever, talking about you, about the baby she'd had, about how she wished she could find you to tell you the truth." The words hit Comanche like physical blows. Isabella had been thinking of him in her final moments, had wanted to reach out to him despite everything that had happened between them. The knowledge was both a gift and a torment, proof that their love had survived their separation, but also a reminder of all the time they had lost. "She made me promise something," Morrison continued, his voice growing quieter. "Made me swear that if anything happened to her, I would make sure you knew about Alina, that I would protect the child if she was ever in danger." "Protect her?" Diego laughed harshly. You are nothing but a drunk and a failure, just like you were during the war." Morrison's face hardened. "Maybe I was once. But people changed, Delgado. Isabella's death. It made me realize I needed to become the man I should have been all along. So I cleaned myself up, took a job with the territorial government, and started making amends for the mistakes I'd made." He looked at Comanche with something that might have been respect. "Including the mistake I made that night in Tucson, when I let my own bitterness and jealousy drive me to say things that should never have been said. Isabella loved you, Garrett. Even after you left, even when she was dying, she loved you. And she would have wanted her daughter to know her father." The hired gunman chose that moment to make his move, swinging his rifle toward Morrison. But Comanche was faster, his Colt barking twice in rapid succession. The man spun and fell, his weapon clattering harmlessly across the floor. Diego cursed and tightened his grip on Maria, but Morrison was already moving, his own pistol now trained on the old man. "It's over, Delgado," Morrison said calmly. "Your men outside have already surrendered. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Let Maria go, and we can end this without any more bloodshed." Diego's eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Through the windows, he could see cavalry troopers moving into position, their rifles ready but not yet aimed at the house. It was clear that Captain Harrison was hoping to end the standoff peacefully, but equally clear that he was prepared for violence if necessary. "You don't understand," Diego said desperately. "That child is an abomination. She will grow up to be nothing but trouble, a reminder of shame and sin. It would be a mercy to what?" Comanche interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "To kill an innocent baby because you're too proud to admit that your daughter loved someone you didn't approve of." "Isabella was promised to another," Diego shouted. A good man, a respectable man who would have given her a proper life. Instead, she chose to degrade herself with a gringo killer, a man who couldn't even stay to face his responsibilities. "You're right," Comanche said, surprising everyone in the room. "I did run. I was afraid of what Isabella deserved, afraid I wasn't good enough for her, but I won't run anymore. Elena is my daughter, and I'll die before I let you harm her." "And you won't have to die," Morrison added, "because this ends now, one way or another." Diego seemed to deflate slightly, the weight of his situation finally sinking in. He was trapped, his hired guns defeated or captured, facing federal charges. That would destroy him and his family's reputation far more thoroughly than Elena's existence ever could. But even as defeat stared him in the face, his pride would not let him surrender. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think capturing me will end this? There are others in Santa Fe who share my views, others who will not let this child live to contaminate decent society. She will never be safe, never be accepted. You are condemning her to a life of persecution and hatred." "Maybe," Comanche replied, "but it will be her life, her choice. And she'll face it knowing she's loved, knowing she has family who will stand by her no matter what the world thinks." Maria chose that moment to act. With a sudden twist, she broke free from her father's loosened grip and threw herself toward Elena, scooping up the baby and rolling behind the overturned table that Comanche had used for cover earlier. Diego, caught off guard by his daughter's unexpected movement, hesitated for a crucial second. That second was all Morrison needed. He lunged forward, tackling Diego around the waist and sending them both crashing to the floor. Diego's pistol went off, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the ceiling, and then Morrison was on top of him, pinning his arms while Comanche covered them both with his Colt. "It's over," Morrison panted, wrestling the gun away from Diego's grip. "Captain Harrison, we need some assistance in here." The cavalry officer appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had dealt with many such situations. Behind him came two troopers who quickly moved to secure Diego while Morrison climbed to his feet, brushing dust from his uniform. "Are you hurt, miss?" Captain Harrison asked Maria, who was still crouched behind the table with Elena in her arms. "No," Maria replied shakily. "We're fine. The baby's fine." Harrison nodded and turned to Comanche. "Mr. Garrett, I presume? Marshal Morrison has filled me in on the situation. I understand there's been some question about custody of the child." Comanche looked at Elena, who was being gently rocked by Maria, her dark eyes still wide, but no longer frightened. "No question at all, Captain. She's my daughter, and she stays with me. And you have proof of this claim?" Maria reached into her dress and pulled out a folded document. "Isabella left this," she said, holding it out to Harrison. "It's Elena's birth certificate." She listed Samuel Garrett as the father. Harrison examined the document carefully, then nodded. "That seems to settle the matter legally. Diego Delgado, you're under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, and crossing territorial lines with armed intent. Your men will be charged as accomplices." Diego, now in custody but still defiant, glared at Comanche with undimmed hatred. "This is not over," he said. "That child will bring nothing but sorrow and shame to everyone who touches her life. Mark my words, no good will come of this." "Maybe not," Comanche replied, taking Elena from Maria's arms and holding his daughter for the second time. "But she face whatever comes knowing she's loved. That's more than you ever gave Isabella." The accusation hit home, and for a moment, Diego's facade of righteous anger cracked. Comanche saw something like regret flicker in the old man's eyes, as if he was suddenly remembering the daughter he had lost to disease and his own pride. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the bitter mask of a man who could not admit his mistakes even when they destroyed everything he claimed to value. as the cavalry troopers led Diego and his surviving men away. Morrison lingered in the doorway. "Garrett," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. What I did in Tucson, the things I said. I was drunk and bitter and looking for someone to blame for my own failures. Isabella paid the price for my weakness." Comanche looked at the man who had once been his enemy, seeing the genuine remorse in his face. "We all paid a price, Morrison. The question now is what we do with the time we have left." Morrison nodded. "Isabella asked me to give you something else," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "She kept it with her until the end, said it was the only thing she had left of the man she loved." He held out a small, leather-bound book, the same collection of Walt Whitman poetry that Comanche had been reading to Isabella during their evenings at the Copper Crown. On the first page, in Isabella's careful handwriting, was an inscription he had never seen before. "For Samuel, who taught me that love is not about possession, but about letting someone fly free, even when it breaks your heart. Our daughter will carry the best of both of us into the world. I forgive you for leaving, and I hope someday you can forgive yourself. All my love, always. Isabella." Comanche felt tears burning his eyes as he read the words. Isabella had understood why he left, had forgiven him even as she died alone and heartbroken. The knowledge was both a blessing and a burden, proof that their love had been real, but also a reminder of how much his fear had cost them both. "She never stopped loving you," Morrison said softly. "Even at the end, when the fever was killing her, she would whisper your name. She died hoping you would find Alina someday, hoping you would be the father she never had a chance to tell you about." Comanche closed the book and held it against his chest, next to Elena's warm, sleeping form. "Thank you," he said simply, "for bringing her to me, for protecting them both. I know it couldn't have been easy." Morrison shrugged. "Like I said, people change. Isabella's death taught me that some things are more important than old grudges and wounded pride. A child deserves to know her father, especially when that father is willing to fight for her." He tipped his hat to Maria, who was watching the exchange with tears in her eyes. "Miss Delgado, you showed tremendous courage bringing Elena here. Your sister would be proud." "What will happen to our father?" Maria asked quietly. "He'll face trial," Morrison replied honestly. "The charges are serious kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy. He's looking at years in territorial prison, assuming the judge doesn't decide to make an example of him." Maria nodded sadly. "He brought it on himself, his pride, his hatred. It consumed everything good in him." Isabella tried to make him understand, but he wouldn't listen. "What about you?" Comanche asked. "You risked everything to bring Elena to me. Where will you go now?" Maria looked around the battle-scarred room, then at Elena sleeping peacefully in her father's arms. "If you'll have me," she said hesitantly, "I'd like to stay. Elena is all I have left of Isabella, and she needs someone to teach her about her mother, about where she came from." Comanche considered this. His solitary life was already over. Elena's presence had guaranteed that. And Maria had proven herself brave and loyal, willing to sacrifice her own safety for her niece's welfare. More than that, she was Elena's connection to Isabella, to the woman he had loved and lost. "You're welcome here," he said finally. "Elena should know about her mother, should understand the courage it took for Isabella to protect her even when she was dying, and ... He paused, then continued with difficulty. "I'll need help learning how to be a father. I never had much of an example to follow." Maria smiled through her tears. "Isabella always said you were a good man who had forgotten how to trust himself. Maybe Elena will help you remember." As if summoned by her name, Elena opened her dark eyes and looked up at Comanche with that same intense gaze that had unsettled him from the first moment. But now, instead of feeling unworthy of that scrutiny, he felt something else, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of finally having found his place in the world. "Hello, little one," he whispered to his daughter. "Welcome home." Outside, the sun was climbing higher in the desert sky, burning away the last traces of the storm that had brought Maria and Elena to his door. The immediate danger was over, Diego and his men defeated and captured. But Comanche knew that this was not truly the end, it was a beginning. Elena would face challenges as she grew up, would encounter people who shared Diego's prejudices and hatred. But she would also have something that many children never had, a father who loved her unconditionally, who would fight for her, no matter what the cost. The man who had once been afraid of connection, afraid of the vulnerability that love required, had finally learned what Isabella had tried to teach him 2 years ago in Tucson. Love was not about avoiding pain or minimizing risk. It was about choosing to care for someone more than you cared for yourself, about finding the courage to fight for what mattered most. As Comanche held his daughter and looked at Maria, the brave woman who had risked everything to bring Elena home, he realized that his real life was just beginning. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, was finally behind him. The future, uncertain but full of possibility, stretched ahead like an uncharted trail through the desert. And for the first time since Isabella's death, Comanche found himself looking forward to seeing where that trail would lead. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and cooling earth through the valley as Comanche stood on the porch of his rebuilt home, watching Elena take her first tentative steps across the wooden planks. At 9 months old, she was already showing the determined spirit that had carried her through the dangerous journey from Santa Fe, her dark eyes bright with curiosity as she explored this new world that had become her sanctuary. "Careful, Pequega," Maria called from the doorway, her voice filled with the gentle warmth that had made her indispensable to their small family. "Your papa won't forgive me if you tumble off the porch." Comanche smiled at the word papa. It still felt strange on his tongue, this new identity that had replaced the solitary tracker known throughout the territory. But with each passing day, with each laugh from Elena and each moment of quiet contentment, he found himself growing into the role that fate had thrust upon him. The months since Diego's arrest had brought changes that none of them could have anticipated. The trial had been swift and decisive. Diego Delgado and his hired gunmen were sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison for kidnapping and attempted murder. The old man had shown no remorse, even as the judge read his sentence, his final words being a curse upon Elena and all who would shelter her. But his threats had proven empty. News of the confrontation had spread throughout the territory, carried by the cavalry troopers and territorial officials who had witnessed the standoff. Far from bringing shame upon Elena, the story had generated sympathy and support from unexpected quarters. Settlers who had struggled with their own mixed heritage, soldiers who had served with honor alongside Mexican allies, and even some of the more progressive citizens of Copper Ridge had rallied around the small family. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, the widow who ran the general store in town, had been the first to visit after the dust settled. She had arrived with a wagon full of baby clothes and supplies, her Irish brogue thick with emotion as she declared that any child brave enough to survive such an ordeal deserved all the help the community could provide. My own Patrick faced similar troubles, she had told Comanche, referring to her late husband whose Irish Catholic heritage had made him unwelcome in many Protestant communities. Love makes families, not bloodlines or church records. That little girl is lucky to have found her way to you. Others had followed. Tom Yazzie, the Apache scout who worked for the territorial government, had brought traditional blessing herbs and offered to teach Elena about her desert heritage. The Reverend Samuel Wright, whose Methodist church served most of Copper Ridge's Protestant population, had surprised everyone by requesting permission to baptize Elena and welcome her formally into the community. Most surprising of all had been the response from Elena's own extended family. Maria's cousin, Roberto Delgado, had traveled from Tucson with a letter from several family members who had been horrified by Diego's actions. They wanted to establish contact with Elena to ensure. She knew she had relatives who loved her despite her grandfather's hatred. Isabella would have been so proud, Maria had said as she read the letter aloud. She always believed that love was stronger than prejudice, that family bonds could overcome any obstacle. But it was another letter that had truly changed everything. But it was another letter that had truly changed everything. Letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, carried by a territorial mail rider who had been specifically instructed to deliver it directly to Samuel Garrett. Also known as Comanche, the letter bore the official seal of the territorial governor, and as Comanche read its contents, he felt his world shift once again. The governor was offering him a position as territorial marshal with jurisdiction over the entire Arizona territory. The recommendation had come from Captain Harrison and Marshal Morrison, both of whom had been impressed by his handling of the Delgado situation. The territory needs men of proven courage and integrity, the letter read. Your actions in protecting an innocent child, despite significant personal risk, demonstrate the kind of character we require in our law enforcement officials. The position would require occasional travel, but you would be based in Copper Ridge, and would have considerable autonomy in how you carry out your duties. The offer was generous, a substantial salary, a chance to make a real difference in the territory, and the respect that came with official authority. But it also represented a fundamental choice about the kind of life he wanted to build for Elena. What do you think? He asked Maria that evening as they sat on the porch, Elena sleeping peacefully in her new crib. Should I accept? Maria considered the question carefully. It would mean you could help other families, other children who might face what Elena faced, but it would also mean danger, time away from home. What does your heart tell you? Comanche looked out across the desert valley, thinking of all the injustices he had witnessed over the years, all the times he had turned away from other people's troubles to preserve his own solitude. Elena had changed, that had shown him that some responsibilities were too important to ignore. I think, he said slowly, that Elena should grow up knowing her father stood for something. That when people threatened the innocent, there were men willing to fight back. Then you have your answer, Maria said with a smile. Isabella always said you were meant for something greater than hiding in the desert. Maybe this is what she saw in you. The decision to accept the marshal's position had consequences that rippled through their small community. Comanche's first official act was to establish a policy of protection for children of mixed heritage, working with tribal leaders, Mexican officials, and territorial authorities to create safe havens for families facing persecution. Elena became, in many ways, the symbol of this new approach, a child who had survived hatred and violence to find love and acceptance. Visitors came from across the territory to see the family that had stood against prejudice and won, and Elena charmed them all with her bright smile and fearless curiosity. But the most important change was not in Comanche's professional life, but in his personal one. The man who had once been afraid of connection, afraid of the vulnerability that love required, found himself part of a community that extended far beyond his small adobe house. Mrs. Brennan had become Elena's unofficial grandmother, spoiling her with treats and toys whenever the family came to town. Reverend Wright had established a small school in Copper Ridge, with Elena as his first student when she became old enough to learn. Tom Yazzie taught her Apache words and showed her how to read the signs of the desert, while Roberto Delgado shared stories of their Mexican heritage. Most importantly, Maria had become not just Elena's caretaker, but Comanche's partner in building the life Isabella had dreamed of. There was no romantic attachment between them. Maria had made it clear that her heart belonged to a young teacher in Tucson who had been courting her before Diego's extremism had forced her to flee. But there was deep affection, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to Elena's welfare that made them a formidable team. "We are not the family that anyone expected," Maria said one evening as they watched Elena play with a wooden horse that Tom Yazzie had carved for her. "But we are the family that chose each other, and that makes us strong." As autumn deepened into winter, Comanche found himself thinking often of Isabella and the love they had shared. The pain of her loss would never fully fade, but it had transformed into something else, a determination to honor her memory by becoming the man she had believed he could be. Elena would grow up knowing she was loved unconditionally, knowing she had a father who would fight for her no matter what challenges arose. She would also know about her mother, the brave woman who had protected her even while dying, who had loved deeply and forgiven completely. The wooden birds that Isabella had once admired were now scattered throughout their home, some carved by Comanche himself as he learned to work with his hands in new ways. Each one represented a memory, a hope, a dream taking flight. And Elena, crawling among them with delighted laughter, seemed to understand that she was surrounded by love made visible. One evening, as Comanche sat reading to Elena from the book of poetry that Isabella had returned to him, he came across a passage that seemed to speak directly to their situation. "These are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. They are not original with me. If they are not yours as much as mine, they are nothing or next to nothing." He looked at his daughter, who was listening with the intense concentration that had marked her from birth, and realized that Whitman had understood something fundamental about love and family. The bonds that held them together were not diminished by being shared with others, they were strengthened. Elena belonged not just to him, but to Maria, to their extended community, to the memory of Isabella, to the future they were all building. Together, love, Comanche had finally learned, was not about possession or exclusivity. It was about creating something larger than yourself, something that could survive loss and grow stronger through adversity. Elena would face challenges as she grew up, would encounter people who shared Diego's prejudices. But she would also have something more powerful than hate. She would have love, in all its forms, surrounding her like armor. As the stars appeared in the clear desert sky, Comanche held his daughter close and whispered the words that had become his nightly prayer. "Your mama loved you, Elena. I love you. And you will never be alone." The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of promise, and for the first time in his life, Comanche was not afraid of what it might bring. The Apache boy couldn't have been more than 12, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much. He sat on the steps of the territorial marshal's office in Copper Ridge, his clothes torn and dusty, blood dried on his lip where someone had struck him. When Marshal Samuel Garrett, no longer called Comanche except by old friends, approached, the boy tensed as if preparing to run. "Easy there, son," Samuel said, settling onto the step beside him. "Nobody's going to hurt you here. What's your name?" The boy's dark eyes darted toward the street where a group of men had gathered, their voices carrying ugly words about half-breed thieves and teaching lessons. Samuel recognized the look of cornered desperation, the same expression he had seen in Maria's eyes that stormy night 6 years ago. "Joseph," the boy whispered. "Joseph Crowfeather." "Well, Joseph Crowfeather, I'm Marshal Garrett. And that's my daughter Elena playing over there." Samuel nodded toward the small garden beside the office where a 5-year-old girl with Isabella's dark hair and his own stubborn chin was teaching her doll to read from a picture book. Elena looked up at the sound of her name and smiled at the boy with the fearless warmth that had made her beloved throughout the territory. "Papa, is he hurt? Should I get Tia Maria?" "In a minute, Mia." "Joseph, can you tell me what happened?" The story came out in fragments: a stolen horse accusation, a mob forming, the boy running through the desert for 2 days with nothing but the clothes on his back. His parents had been killed in a raid 3 months ago, and he had been living with his Apache grandmother on the reservation until today's trouble. Samuel listened without interruption, his mind already forming a plan. This was exactly the kind of situation that had driven him to accept the marshal's position. Children caught between worlds, facing hatred for the simple crime of existing. "Elena," he called to his daughter. "Run get Tia Maria and tell her. We have a guest for dinner." As Elena scampered toward the house, her braids bouncing with each step, Joseph watched with something like wonder. "She's not afraid of me, should she be?" Samuel asked. "The people in town, they say I'm dangerous. Say my kind brings nothing but trouble." Samuel thought of another child, another accusation, another storm that had changed everything. People say a lot of things when they're afraid of what they don't understand. But Elena's learned that family comes in all shapes and colors. Haven't you, Mia? Elena had returned with Maria, whose face immediately softened when she saw the boy's condition. "Ay, Dios mío, what happened to you, Niña?" As Maria fussed over Joseph, cleaning his wounds and pressing food into his hands, Samuel watched his daughter with pride. Elena had grown up in a household where Spanish mixed freely with English and Apache, where visitors arrived speaking a dozen different languages, where love was measured not by bloodlines, but by actions. "Papa," Elena said. Later that evening, as they watched Joseph sleep on the porch, wrapped in one of Maria's quilts. "Will Joseph stay with us like Tia Maria did?" Samuel considered the question. Joseph's grandmother was elderly and could not protect him from the prejudices he would face. The boy needed education, opportunity, and most importantly, a chance to grow up without fear. "Would you like him to stay?" Elena nodded seriously. "He looks sad like the pictures of you before I was born, before you learned to smile again." The observation was so perceptive that Samuel felt his breath catch. In the 5 years since Elena's arrival, he had indeed learned to smile again, had discovered that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely. "Then we'll see what we can do." The next morning brought the inevitable confrontation with the men who had been hunting Joseph. They arrived at the marshal's office with demands and threats. Their leader, a rancher named Blackwood, who had been vocal in his opposition to Samuel's policies regarding mixed heritage children. "That boy stole my horse, Marshal. I want him arrested and tried." Samuel studied the bill of sale Blackwood produced, noting the convenient timing and suspiciously fresh ink. "Interesting. Joseph says he was given this horse by his grandmother in trade for firewood. Tom Yazzie confirms the transaction. You're taking the word of savages over a white man? I'm taking the word of witnesses over a liar," Samuel replied calmly. "The horse stays with Joseph, and you stay away from him. That's not a request." As Blackwood and his men rode away, muttering threats, Samuel realized that some battles would never truly end. But for every man like Blackwood, there were others like Reverend Wright, Mrs. Brennan, and Roberto Delgado, people who chose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion. Elena had been watching from the window, and now she slipped her small hand into his. "Papa, will there always be angry people?" Samuel looked down at his daughter, brilliant, compassionate, completely unaware that some people considered her very existence a problem to be solved. "Yes, Mia. But there will always be good people too. And as long as good people stand together, love wins." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Elena played quietly with Joseph, teaching him a card game that Maria had shown her, their laughter mixing with the evening wind. Maria emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "The school board approved Joseph's enrollment," she announced. "He starts Monday." Samuel nodded, satisfied. One more child saved, one more future secured. "Papa," Elena said suddenly, "tell me again about the storm when I came home." Samuel smiled and pulled his daughter onto his lap, beginning the story she never tired of hearing about a brave woman who traveled through danger to keep a promise. About a man who learned that love was stronger than fear. About a family that chose each other against all odds. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel understood that this was Isabella's true legacy, not just Elena, but the ripples of compassion that spread outward from every act of love, every stand against hatred, every child given a chance to belong. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and Samuel Garrett Marshall, father, protector of the vulnerable, finally knew he was exactly where he belonged.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.